And now it is my honor and pleasure to introduce to you John Holdren, research professor in Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, former science advisor to President Obama, and director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Welcome to the podium for his keynote address focused on the impact of international cooperation on climate change in the Arctic. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Pia. It is certainly an honor for me to be able to address this very distinguished group. I'm going to tell you a number of things that most of you already know, but I hope put them together in a useful way. And the best news is I'm going to do it briefly. Cooperation on Arctic climate change is needed among nations, as well as across subnational levels of governments, corporations, universities, NGOs, indigenous organizations, for two very big reasons. The first reason is that cooperation is needed to understand the causes and consequences of climate change in the Arctic, including how the emissions of greenhouse gases from fossil fuel use and land use worldwide, emissions mostly occurring outside the Arctic, are causing the Arctic to warm 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. How people, economies, and ecosystems in the Arctic are being adversely impacted, for example, sea ice retreat, permafrost thaw, intensifying wildfires, impacts of warming on species of both commercial and subsistence importance. How Arctic climate change is altering and opening opportunities such as new northern sea routes, increased access to resources formerly locked out of reach under ice, often requiring cooperative management to ensure that the benefits exceed the liabilities. And finally, how what's happening in the Arctic isn't staying in the Arctic, as we've been hearing, but rather is impacting the rest of the world through the influence of Arctic climate change on global sea level rise, on emissions of greenhouse gases from warming Arctic soils, on weather patterns, ocean currents, and drifting wildfire smoke across much of the Northern Hemisphere. Understanding all of this, both what is happening now and what is likely to happen going forward, clearly requires integrating observations, measurements, analyses, and insights, not just across the Arctic, but worldwide. In significant measure, we know as much as we do about the causes and consequences of Arctic climate change and climate change in general because of the degree of international cooperation that has existed for many decades on the science of these particular issues. That cooperation has included international polar years, starting amazingly in 1882 and 83, also in 1932 and 33, and 2007 and 9, another one coming up in the early 2030s. The 1957-58 International Geophysical Year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, created by the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Environment Program in 1988, the International Arctic Science Committee, founded in 1990, the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, established in 1991, which later became one of the 6 working groups of the Arctic Council, of which we've heard a lot, and of course the University of the Arctic, and more. The work of these multilateral scientific entities has long been complemented by the innumerable bilateral cooperations organized by combinations of nations and subnational governments, businesses, universities, philanthropies, NGOs, and indigenous organizations. From all of this work, scientists and informed citizens everywhere know that beyond any scientific doubt, Earth's climate is changing much faster as a result of human actions than it's known to do under natural influences. And we know that the consequences for human well-being are far more negative than positive. We also know that the human drivers of global climate change are not immutable, but changeable by societal actions. The second big reason that international and subnational cooperation are needed in the climate domain is precisely to translate our understandings about the causes and consequences into agreement on what measures need to be implemented, where, by whom, and in what magnitudes if the worst consequences of climate change are to be avoided. And I should say, by that I mean the worst consequences both in the Arctic and worldwide. Beyond the focus on the measures needed, of course, cooperation is also required to reach agreement on financing and other assistance for carrying out those measures in countries and communities in need of such help, many of them among those most impacted by climate change, without, in most cases, having contributed much to its causes. And that, of course, is decidedly the case for the indigenous peoples of the Arctic. Here again, international cooperation has contributed importantly to progress, but mainly in advancing agreement on how much needs to be done to reduce the offending emissions. Less about how exactly to do that, and even less how best to advance adaptation to climate change that can no longer be avoided, and much less still about financing and assistance for countries in need. By far the most important global international cooperation in this global solution space has taken place under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, agreed in 1992, its annual conferences of the parties beginning in 1995 and continuing up to the present, and the focuses on adaptation and mitigation in working groups 2 and 3 of the IPCC. The most important international focus on climate solutions in the Arctic has taken place, as we've already heard, under the Arctic Council, established in 1996, whose working groups and projects have included focuses on green energy, mitigation of black carbon and methane emissions, resilience, and more. The Council's achievements on cooperative approaches to Central Arctic Ocean fisheries and safety in Arctic Ocean navigation have been especially notable. As with international cooperation on climate science, the multilateral efforts on solutions have been complemented by a wide variety of bilateral cooperations involving actors from many different sectors. Now, although the achievements of the Arctic Council and other international collaborations on the science and solution space around impacts of climate change in the Arctic have been significant, the needed degree of cooperation on climate change across countries is currently being hindered by several factors. And we've heard about some of them already, but I'll say them again. Number one, the hostility of the current U.S. administration to climate science, renewable energy, and international cooperation other than in U.S. defense interests. Number two, the isolation from international collaboration that Russia imposed on itself by invading Ukraine. And third, the political tensions between the governments of the United States and China, the former, the United States, the richest Arctic nation and the second biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, and China, a seriously Arctic interested nation, which is also, by the way, the biggest global greenhouse gas emitter. President Trump has essentially destroyed U.S. government funding for climate change science, has drastically cut its funding for green energy, climate change adaptation, and non-military foreign assistance, and has announced U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, from the Loss and Damage Fund, from UNESCO, and from the World Health Organization. And he seems bent on persuading U.S. allies who have been taking climate change seriously that they are the victims of a hoax. His interest in the Arctic, President Trump's interest in the Arctic, appears to be limited to resource access and national security, without recognizing any connection between those issues and climate change. President Putin's launch of an all-out war on Ukraine, commencing in February 2022, led quickly to the near total cessation of government-to-government cooperation with Russia by Western states. Finland and Sweden joined NATO, making 7 of the Arctic Council member states allied against the 8th, and the work of the Council shrunk to a shadow of its former self. Only in February of last year, under the leadership of Norway's chairship, did the Council's working groups start to creep back into action, with Russians taking part in meetings held virtually, as we again have already heard. Below the government level, a few contacts between Russian and Western Arctic researchers have continued in neutral venues, for example, in Switzerland, in Turkey, and elsewhere. But most of those kinds of interactions have met the same fate as the official ones. Turning to China, China calls itself a near-Arctic nation and clearly aspires to playing a significant role in the region. At last year's Arctic Circle Assembly here, Chinese climate envoy Liu Junlin defended China's interest in the Arctic in terms of the importance of new northern sea routes to China's economy and the reality that Arctic climate change is seriously impacting China's weather. Both of those arguments, in my view, have merit, but the United States has been challenging the presence of Chinese vessels in Arctic international waters near Alaska. It's being widely said that the era of Arctic exceptionalism is over, an era when the Arctic was a domain of peaceful cooperation rather than a domain of contention for advantage and domination. And surely the Arctic is on the edge of such a transition. But people of good sense and goodwill must do everything in our power to pull back from the edge and to rebuild cooperative exceptionalism. Achieving the benefits of that for the Arctic region, its peaceful and sustainable development, the preservation of its indigenous cultures, equitable access for the world to the common property resources of the Central Arctic Ocean, the amelioration of the harms of Arctic climate change inside the region and beyond. All of those benefits would be preferable by far to allowing continuation of the region's descent into destructive and dangerous forms of competition. The revival of Arctic exceptionalism will not happen, I fear, while Trump and Putin remain in power. But we must work to minimize the damage in whatever ways we can while they remain in office and prepare to rebuild after they are gone. Thank you.